Welcome everyone to today's UTP Talks event for our book, Federalism in Canada, Contested Concepts and Uneasy Balances by Thomas Hugon. To start, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Mike Byer. I'm UTP's sales manager, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel. Today on our panel, we are joined by the author of Federalism in Canada, Thomas Hugon. Dr. Hugon is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University. We're also joined by Francois Lalonde, who is a professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa, Angela Cameron, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa, and John Kincaid, who is the Robert B. and Helen S. Minor Professor of Government and Public Service and Director of the Minor Center for the Study of State and Local Government at Lafayette College. I'm excited to be a part of this webinar. Dr. Hugon was one of my instructors when I completed my MA at Laurier a decade ago, and I read his book last summer. I thought it was a really clear survey of this topic, so I've been looking forward to listening to this discussion. We're going to start by having Thomas introduce his book, and then we'll have the panelists offer some comments on the book, and then we'll follow with some prepared questions for the panel on some key topics. I want to encourage everyone in the audience to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit questions. These can be for the panel to discuss at the end of our planned discussion, or for my UTP colleagues to answer about how to buy this book or any other inquiries for the press. At the end, we'll take any questions we have time for. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
So before I begin, I would really like to thank the participants, Angela, Francois, and John, for doing this. And of course, I would also like to thank Mike, Jane, and Brianna, the latter two being in the background, for organizing it. So this is really, I can only hope the book deserves it. By means of introduction, I really only want to say as briefly as possible a few things, because most of the time should really be for discussion and to hear from the others what they think about it. Maybe one sentence about the subtitle, which is Contested Concepts and Uneasy Balances. I hope we get to discuss that later, and I think we will. All I want to say now is, all federal systems are characterized by an ongoing dynamic of conflict and compromise, which is in the nature of federalism, because it is a political system where powers are shared by two orders of government. What I found, or what I thought at least, is that in Canada, the conflicts go much deeper. They are about contested concepts. There is this agreement still in Canada to some extent what federalism should be, how it should be practiced in Canada. And it is this kind of foundational almost conflict that animates a lot of the dynamic of how federalism in Canada unfolds. So I set myself 3 objectives for this book, and I will briefly introduce them. The first one is I wanted to make, as I write, maybe a little bit pompously, I wanted to make federalism interesting again. I felt that after the 1990s in Canada, the failed Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords, the second referendum in Quebec, there was a certain federalism fatigue setting in. People wanted to get on with their lives and not continue discussing the Constitution every 5 minutes. And I found over the last 10 years or so that also students, first of all, weren't terribly interested in federalism. They also knew very, very little about it. So students are interested in, what is close to their heart. I don't know, healthcare, post-secondary education, jobs, but they did not, for the most part, have much of a clue of how this plays out in a federal system, or more particular in the Canadian federal system. So I thought it was necessary to remind them in a roundabout way of the origins of Canadian federalism, the critical junctures when Canadian federalism went through crisis and changed, and so on and so forth. The second objective was that I had heard many times that in Quebec there's a perception that the English Canadian literature doesn't take the Quebec perspective on Canadian federalism, or on federalism generally, seriously enough. I think this is probably not quite true. I've read many thoughtful comments about Quebec's perspective on federalism in English Canadian literature, but generally I think it is probably true that there is a need to make that more integrated part of a book on Federalism Canada. So that's what I tried to do. The third objective was that I really thought in this day and age, a book on federalism in Canada needs a sustained Indigenous perspective. I was quite, as the saying goes, shocked and appalled when I reread Garth Stevenson's Unfulfilled Union, and I think Unfulfilled Union is still one of the best books on Canadian federalism written, but it has, even the fifth edition of 2012 had no Indigenous perspective whatsoever. So that's what I wanted to do, and it was the hardest part. It was also the way I struggled with that also led to most of the suggestions for revision by the anonymous reviewers. And I can only hope that I somehow succeeded. It's very difficult, to put it a little bit bluntly, to have a sustained Indigenous perspective on Canadian federalism when, at least until 1982, the objective of that federalism was to keep the Indians out, not in. And so it was difficult I'll have to leave it to the commentators what they think about it. One last very brief comment that I would like to add. There is already one review of the book in the Canadian Journal of Political Science by a very bright young Quebec political scientist, Félix Mathieu. It's a very generous, a very positive review. I have no complaints. But there's one criticism that stuck with me a little bit, because he thinks I treat the so-called multinationalism perspective in literature in a bit of a cavalier manner. And I wanted to say just one sentence about that. So multinationalism basically thinks that Canada is not a federation of provinces, but of nations. This is simplistic, but let's leave it for now. I'm sure we can discuss that later too. And I thought it wasn't helpful, because the criteria with which this literature investigates how various ethno-linguistic minorities are situated in larger countries, whether it's Quebec or Scotland or South Tyrolia, is excellent work. But for me, I feel it is not very helpful in explaining Canadian federalism, because the criteria, the analytical criteria that literature uses, by and large, is the same that I use more generally in order to analyze federalism. So that's why I also have to, and this is my last sentence in closing, I also have to admit that I have a very strong anti-nationalist bias, which probably has to do with the fact that I grew up as the first post-war generation in post-World War and post-Nazi Germany. And I think nationalism is a 19th century fabrication, and federalism should be a tool to overcome it and not accommodate it, which is not to say that federalism's primary, in a diverse federation like ours, federalism's primary role is not to accommodate diversity. That is, for me, a completely different issue. And herewith, I stop, and looking forward what else will transpire during the next 50 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Thomas. So for initial comments, we'll start with Francois, and then he'll be followed by Angela, and then we'll finish with John, and then we'll move on to our question component. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Francois.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I would say that I first discussed the project with Tom when he came at the University of Ottawa in a small seminar to discuss his project. And one point I made to him and to my other colleagues was that what was missing in the literature was a book that deals not only with federalism as a structure of governance, but as how federalism is informed by a specific idea and specific ideas of what the Canadian community is or has been imagined. And I think that the idea of contested federalism came from that discussion we had that time, because for years I'm telling my students that one of the problems is that we speak the same language, but we do not refer to the same concepts or the way we define those concepts. And one thing is that federalism has always or often been seen as a tool to manage the division of powers and who is responsible of what. Whereas what is part of the Canadian history or the Canadian story is that people who joined in the beginning had different perspectives about what it should be. And those perspectives have informed political actors and how they dealt with the structure of federalism. And what is good with Tom's book is that he took that comment seriously, and he paid great attention to make sure that those different perspectives are exposed in detail in the book. And then the conflicts are not always about having access to resources, but it's also about what we are constructing. And what the book is telling, or the story the book is telling, is that Canada has been constructed, or Canadian federalism has been constructed through conflicts about those ideas which were conflicting in the political arena. And the last time it became very crucial in our recent history were during the constitutional debates. We didn't solve it, and so it's why federalism is an unfinished business, as it's well explained in the book. And it's also an unfinished business, or a totally incomplete business, when times come to deal with the way we recognize the Aboriginal First Nations into our system. And well, we can criticize some aspects of the book, but the great virtue of the book is to have taken into account those different stories who are colliding and trying to resolve something that was seen as difficult to fix from the very beginning. So it's why I enjoyed reading the book. It's why I think that it shed a different light, which was, in my view, absent in the current literature. And it's why at the end, I think that Thomas has a more optimistic view than I, but at the end, we're still struggling with the same type of conflict. So Canadian federalism is not an unresolved issue. We're still fighting about, for instance, the way collaboration will be conducted with too many central intervention, with enough opening to what the provinces and how the provinces should participate in processes, and how we incorporate civil society organizations into the broad discussions about many issues we're facing, and so on and so forth. But in a nutshell, this book is is probably the best one I've read for the past decade, dealing with the many issues, conflicts, and perspectives that are colliding in the current times.
Thank you, Francois. Angela.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks for including me. I'm joining you from unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa. I teach at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. And I really enjoyed reading the book because as a law professor, I spend an inordinate amount of my time distilling the legal doctrine from appellate level cases on federalism in the constitutional context. We don't always have time to do a great job of finding the time and space to talk about the larger trends, historical or otherwise. And I think personally, for someone who's teaching the next generation of lawyers and advocates, that context is incredibly important because it gives them a sense of how this is living legal doctrine. And the kinds of narrative approaches that Thomas takes, the storytelling approach that Thomas takes to describing periods of time, important periods of time in Canada, like the New Deal, or the period of time where we had a lot of cases out of the JCPC in Britain at the time, that providing that context creates better lawyers and advocates because they understand that these are still contested concepts, that these living doctrines always have been and therefore still are highly contested. And it gives them a better understanding of what those tools are. It's not an old case about margarine. It's a living idea that is important in the current iteration of Canada and the directions that we want Canada to go, and that lawyers and advocates have an important role to play in sort of deploying those concepts. I really like the narrative style. We have a lot of great books on the law side about constitutional law. They don't all read as beautifully as this one. It's really well cited. I have a list of things, in that kind of cross-disciplinary way that I'm looking forward to reading, that I got from the bibliography and from the footnotes. I've been teaching in constitutional law and division of powers in some way in a university for 20 years, and I learned something new in absolutely every chapter. I've already thought of ways that I'm going to be using the chapter on the New Deal in particular. In my property law class, I do a unit on property, poverty, and the welfare state around the division of powers, and I think that'll be really helpful. And definitely the chapter on the JCPC, it actually made that kind of era of history where we start off our constitutional law courses on division of powers really heavily with these cases that have no meaning in these, mostly young people's lives. I'll definitely be using that chapter in my constitutional law class. And I also appreciated the kind of few very well-placed dry jokes that Thomas put in each of the chapters. So thanks very much.
And finally, John.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. Partly because I really did enjoy reading the book. It was a genuine pleasure to read. Given the work I've been doing recently, it's the only book I read in the last decade, so I can't compare it to other books on Canadian federalism over the last decade. But a couple of things struck me. First of all, I thought the thematic approach was very interesting and useful. Each chapter is a story in itself, but the chapters are connected to each other. And so it's not like a regular textbook. It can be used in classes like a textbook, but fortunately it doesn't read like a textbook. So I think that thematic approach is very, very useful. And I think it should appeal to students. It's written very well, and you can follow along. You kind of want to keep reading. It's not just a recitation of facts. And so I think it will be very appealing to students and probably also to members of the general public who read, books beyond your romantic novels. The other thing I liked about the book as an American is there were quite a number of comparative perspectives in the book that I found to be very useful. Thomas also brings political theory into the book, and I thought that was very useful as well. So those are the kinds of things that I don't recall really seeing in other books on Canadian federalism that I did read in the past. And so I thought it made a larger contribution in that respect, that it can also serve as a book that's a good introduction in many respects to the study of comparative federalism. So, and I kept drawing parallels between what I was reading about Canada and what also the United States. So, it's said that Canada is maybe the only country where you can find books on federalism in the airport bookstore. I certainly hope that this book ends up in the airport bookstores. I think it might be useful to that audience. The book left me with one question, however, and I didn't find that the book quite answered the question of, well, what holds Canada together in the final analysis? So Thomas stresses the flexibility of federalism, intergovernmental negotiations, but what makes that system work where it doesn't work in many other places? Why doesn't Canada look even more contested, let's say like Spain or Cyprus? That was the kind of one question that I was kind of left with after reading this very fascinating and interesting book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those comments. I'll remind the audience that at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A option. If you click on there, you can submit any questions and we'll try to get to them after the prepared questions. The first question is, so as we've heard, one of the organizing principles of this book is the idea of contested concepts. So just to recap, there's three key areas of contested concepts: centralizing versus decentralizing, cooperative federalism versus coordinate federalism, and whether Canadian federalism is a compact amongst provinces or a compact between two nations. A feature of this book is that it gives more attention to Quebec's view of federalism than is often the case in English language lit on this topic, as Thomas mentioned. So how well do these three contested concepts help explain the politics of Quebec's place within Canada? And I think we'll start with Francois, and then anyone can choose to respond.
Thank you. There is a tradition among students of Canadian politics to deal with, or dealing with federalism and paying attention to the concept of centralization versus decentralization. And what is interesting in the book is that those concepts are obviously present in the narrative of the relationship between the provinces, and especially Quebec and the central government, and with the other provinces as well. Nevertheless, I am one of those who believe that Canada can be seen as more decentralized than other federations, but there was a struggle between Ottawa and Quebec in particular about how federalism became over the years more decentralized, especially in the turn of the 20th century, when the GCPC recognized that provincial autonomy was a principle that has to be respected by the federal government. But after the Second War II, we went through another process of going through more centralization, in the sense that in using its spending power, the federal government not invade, but became more active in many provincial jurisdictions, to some extent forcing collaboration, or forcing the resistance of some provinces to collaborate with the federal government. So I think that the story that the book recalls is not one of decentralization, is in the sense that the federal government became more respectful of provincial responsibilities, but it's more a process of the central government becoming more involved in many provincial jurisdictions. And this is something that has been contentious between the Quebec state, or the Quebec governments, and all Quebec governments since the 50s. And this issue has not really been resolved. And we have I would say, a distinct understanding of the meaning of the concept of centralization, decentralization, and decentralization. This aspect, I think, is not under it's not that it's not mentioned in the book, but I think that the perspective on centralization and decentralization has a different meaning in both from both sides. It goes from this point to how the notion of cooperation or collaboration has been seen. Of course, federalism has put in place many cooperative features, and you mentioned them, the First Minister conferences, for instance. But there are lieux where I would say power struggles are at play. And this aspect as well is present in the way you describe the evolution of Canadian federalism. But for some, in some instances, cooperation is also, I would say, a loaded term. Because who might be against increasing cooperation? Sometimes I think it's important to take some distance from the use of terms that have, I would say, a political bias in the sense that I've just described. And this dimension as well is mentioned in Thomas' book. I would like to conclude in saying that for a very long period of time, federalism was seen as a compact between the founding people. And this view has been contested over the past 3 decades, since the defeat of the Charleton Agreement. And it has been replaced by another vision of the country based on an agreement on one hand among citizens, and on the other hand, an agreement among the provinces, including now the First Nations. So the imaginary associated with this turn has been hurtful for the way the many Quebecers see themselves into the Federation. Not that they want necessarily to come back to the old and passé compact theory between the two nations, but there is a desire to seek some stronger recognition of the presence of a people, a nation, or depending how you want to describe them, but a better recognition of this particular sociological aspect of the Canadian society. And in that sense, the federalism has not accomplished its duty properly. And it remains an unfinished agenda. And this aspect of the unfinished agenda of the inconfort Quebecers might have within the Federation has to be mentioned more forcefully. My colleague Guy Laforêt referred to this phenomenon as, the exile of Quebecers from federalism. So not that they do not feel Canadian, but they don't feel that this new country has been modified in 1982, has been welcoming to them. So they feel des exilés de l'intérieur, exile from within, as not being part of the whole system. And this, I think, remains not only an unfinished business, but a feature that is still, I would say, fragilizing the federal system. And this is something that I think shed less optimistic light on how flexible federalism might be in many ways for many Quebecers. The flexibility has had a price, and they paid that price.
Okay, any responses?
Angela first.
I, of course, would like to prize open the forward-looking federalism conversations to include more than two nations, but I think we'll get into that in the next question. I just wanted to say how helpful the concepts developed in the book are. I know that Francois, you were also involved in these conversations about centralizing this notion of a set of vocabulary that some of us come to the table presuming is mutually cognizable, and troubling that notion, right? That when we're talking about decentralization or cooperation, Québécois and folks from Ontario are not necessarily talking about the same thing. I teach at a faculty of law where we're polyruridical. We have civil law, we have droit commun anglais, droit commun français, and we teach Indigenous law, and we are an officially bilingual law school. So this notion of the importance of the place of Quebec in the Canadian constitutional order, and also the francophonie outside of Quebec, is a really important part of how our daily discussions and debates and disagreements go. And I've always had the kind of pedagogical position when I'm teaching about asking ourselves questions about our mutual vocabulary when I'm talking and teaching about Indigenous peoples, right? That constitutionalism and confederation means something very different for Indigenous nations than it does for the Canadian federal state. But this book and your comments, Francois, have urged me to bring that pedagogy, I think, over to my discussions about constitutionalism, federalism, and Quebec's relationship. And even in my daily conversations with my Francophone and Quebecois colleagues, kind of stopping and interrogating whether we're both talking about the same thing. I think that's incredibly useful. And I think it's a pedagogical tool that I will expand beyond my teaching and learning around Indigenous Crown relations as well.
Anyone else? Yeah, John?
Yeah, I was just going to make a brief comparative comment that we had a debate before the Civil War in the United States over whether the federal system, the Constitution that created the federal system, was a compact among the states or a covenant among the people. And the South held the view that it was a compact among the states, and therefore states had the authority to nullify federal law and also to secede from the Union. And so we did not hold it together, and we had a civil war over that issue. There's echoes of this today in the Supreme Court, how to interpret the opening of the Constitution, we the people of the United States. Does that mean we the people of the whole United States, or we the people of the separately United States? And those who hold the view that it's we the people of the whole United States tend to be more centralist and nationalist, and those who view the Constitution the other way tend to be more decentralist and state-oriented. And that is one of the dynamics that underlies the polarization that we see on our Supreme Court today.
Any comments, Thomas, or can we move to the next question?
Just one sentence. I mean, I appreciate what Francois is saying, and I'm probably more optimistic, as you say, and that probably also answers John's initial question: why is Quebec, why is Canada still holding together? And I think it is the flexibility that had at least allowed for a sufficient degree of flexible accommodation that that ultimately, so far at least, has been successful. Whether it's satisfactory is a different matter. Also, I would say that Canadian federalism remains for me an unfinished business, because I don't think it can be ever finished. I think it's a you know, there's this there's this word of the Canadian Odyssey. But I think that's what federalism is. It is an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing dynamic of compromise and conflict. And where you then come down, there we can disagree. And I fully appreciate what Francois is saying.
Interesting. This is actually, the questions and discussion has been getting a little more lively. And some of them lead into what I had planned as the next question. But Julie Simmons had asked about the feeling of exile, the internal exile that Quebecers feel, and how do you have that conversation while also including Indigenous people in that conversation about being exiled. And so how do Indigenous peoples and their own concepts of self-determination fit into these debates? How do we understand the historic treaties and modern land claim agreements within Canadian federalism? So I think we can start with Angela for this one, and then we'll go with comments.
Thanks a lot. First of all, let me say off the top, I'm not an Indigenous person. My French and English ancestors settled what's now Mi'kma'ki, close to Pictou Landing First Nation. I'm grateful to my Indigenous colleagues and the Indigenous scholars across Canada who've written and done such important work on Canadian and Indigenous federalism. I think it's really important that discussions about the future of federalism have to be completely inclusive of Indigenous peoples, including negotiating powers that go far beyond being passive observers or supplicants. But the next time we sit down at the constitutional negotiating tables, Indigenous peoples and nations are there as equals, as equal participants. I think the role of federalism or not in Indigenous self-determination has to be led by Indigenous peoples. I don't have any solutions, but I have a set of questions that I've developed from reading and learning from Indigenous colleagues that I think should underlie any future explorations of better governance models within Canadian federalism. And the starting point for these explorations is in Thomas's book. So given that, I want to move us from maybe into a more radical space of conversation around imagining potential federal orders that are that are better to nation relationships and that serve Indigenous self-determination. I'm going to start outside of the historical and modern treaties completely and encourage us to collectively be more radical in our reimagining of this relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. I'm going to make 3 main points about reimagining federalism, and they're all about paying attention to diversity in 3 ways. So first is diversity of point of views. Second is diversity of laws. And third is diversity amongst people. So diversity of points of view. The views on the place of Indigenous peoples within the Canadian constitutional order and federal state are diverse amongst Indigenous peoples themselves. And we have to take all of those ideas seriously. So Thomas's book does a great job of talking about the brilliant Dr. Youngblood Henderson's model of treaty federalism. It's described really well in the book. I think this is one brilliant way of capturing and understanding the current place of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian federal state. However, other Indigenous scholars and leaders are writing about ways that Indigenous peoples and nations might want to reimagine that relationship with Canada, including some that require a complete reconfiguration of the federal foundations, like the division of powers. So for instance, under 9124, the federal government having jurisdiction over Indigenous peoples would probably be a good place to start asking some serious questions. Scholars like Tracy Lindbergh, John Burroughs, Leanne Simpson, Val Napoleon, and Josh Nichols have all encouraged us to think beyond these current models, including federalism perhaps itself, in the realization of Indigenous self-determination. The second is this point about diversity of laws. A reordering of Canadian federalism must take into account, in my opinion, Indigenous laws and legal orders, and must engage with them seriously as laws and legal orders, alongside common and civil law as the foundations of Indigenous governance and self-determination. There is a diversity of Indigenous laws and legal orders amongst Indigenous nations. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which Thomas mentions in his book, the Confederacy model may have a good fit with and may be cognizable to the common and civil law jurisdictions. It may have even been a blueprint to some level for different kinds of federalism in North America, including perhaps the American model. But Gigsan law, for instance, in governance relies on a model that values the autonomy of houses or WILPs, with accountability between these political and legal units being dictated primarily by matrilineal kinship relationships. So not a perfect match for our current Canadian federalist system, and not as easily cognizable in common and civil law places. So this complexity, I think, is both exciting and daunting, but let's go with exciting. I think it opens an opportunity for non-Indigenous Canadians to deeply engage with a diversity of Indigenous laws and governance models that are going to help us to renew our legal and political imagination in ways that foster Indigenous self-determination, but also maybe help us do a better job in our own federal models, in our own relationships between and across provinces and nations. And finally, and thirdly, diversity amongst peoples. Just like non-Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations aren't homogenous, both in the sense that there may be more than one set of governance models within that nation, so hereditary governance, but also Indian Act leadership, and that communities are made up of men, women, non-binary people, LGBTQ2S+ people, older people, children, people with status, urban, and people without status, and that there are economic and political power imbalances in and amongst those groups, the same as in our communities and nations, and we have to take those into account. I'm not currently convinced that our current federal model does a great job of taking those power imbalances into account for non-Indigenous Canadians, but I hope that reimagining and negotiating federalism going forward is going to require all of us to grapple with representativeness, leadership, and accountability. Thomas's book does a great job of telling the story of how our current federal model was negotiated and decided upon. The great narrative style, the occasional funny comment make it clear that it was and it still is a bit of a mess, right? It's ad hoc. It's a lot about power grabbing, a lot about political posturing, a lot about electoral politics. And I wonder if learning from Indigenous laws and legal orders and the different models of governance that we can do a better job going forward.
Yes, John.
If I could just offer a comparative perspective, and I'll start by borrowing from John Barrow's book, Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism. He argues that although Canada's Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes Indigenous and treaty rights, while the US Constitution does not do so, Indigenous peoples in the United States have more legal control over federal government services for their tribes, more protection for their cultures and communities, and more control over natural resources and economic development. And indeed, Congress passed 3 major laws on Indigenous rights and self-determination in the late 1970s, followed by more such statutes in subsequent decades. So Barrows attributes this to US position to several factors, including the ability of Indigenous peoples to work with allies in Congress to enact laws implementing self-determination. And secondly, the willingness of the federal government to preempt, that is, displace state laws that infringe tribal sovereignty, which he argues the federal government in Canada is less willing to do. I would add that the federal government and state governments, at least since Ronald Reagan's 1983 Indian policy statements, have recognized tribal sovereignty by officially dealing with the 573 tribal nations on a government-to-government basis. So in federal statutes, presidential executive orders, agency regulations, one regularly sees the phrase state, local, and tribal governments. Furthermore, just recently, the US Supreme Court rendered a major decision in 2020, McGirt versus Oklahoma, holding that much of the eastern half of Oklahoma remains Indian land under prior treaties, and that therefore, among other things, the prosecution of crimes committed by Indians on that land falls under the jurisdiction of tribal courts and federal courts, not state courts. So one result has been that Oklahoma's state courts reviewed and vacated thousands of past criminal cases heard in the state's courts as a result of that Supreme Court decision. Also, kind of speaking of treaty federalism, one might take note of the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act requires states to negotiate in good faith compacts with in-state Indian tribes that want to open a casino. So this 1988 act really set the pace for an increase in compacts and intergovernmental agreements between tribes and state and local governments. And also the National Conference of State Legislatures has strongly supported these intergovernmental agreements. So there's an interesting process here to kind of in an ad hoc basis, but taking self-determination rather seriously of incorporating the tribes into the federal system.
Thanks, Francois.
Well, very briefly, one of the lessons we learned when we read that book is that most changes came through or were incremental. And most of the time beyond or beside the Constitution. When times come to, fix big problems, those mechanisms don't work. And when we need to renegotiate the relationship with the First Nations, the current mechanisms are not very useful. We have to reinvent the way we negotiate with powers, with resources, with the constituents of the Canadian system. But not only we do not have the imagination to go through that process, but we don't have the mechanism that allows the society to deal convincingly with those issues. So we might want to renegotiate the status of First Nations, and Angela did a great job in saying that there are many ways and many visions and many possibilities and routes, but the system is not built to face those challenges.
Okay.
So it might be flexible, but to a certain extent, as long as it doesn't question the actual those who are actually benefiting from it.
So I feel like the audience is anticipating some of my questions. The next one was going to be about comparative function, and Simone Bone asked that as a Latin Americanist, he's wondering how amenable the book is to a comparative dialogue. And from my memory of reading it, Thomas includes a lot of comparisons, not a surprise, as he is also a co-author of one of our comparative politics texts. So this question is specifically about Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, Latin American countries that are not asymmetrical federations. So how, in the book and in Canada and your own experience studying federalism, how does the discussion of the how well does the book do as a offering comparative options? I guess I'm having a little trouble synthesizing these questions, but I'll go to Thomas though on this one, since it seems a little more directly about the book.
I don't know. Quite frankly, University of Toronto Press asked me when I had finished with my co-author Alan Fenner, the second edition of Comparative Federalism, would you like to write a book on Canadian federalism? I said yes. This is sort of the crown jewel for Canadian political scientists. I didn't know at that time what I was getting myself into. And I should quickly acknowledge that I forgot to say that at the outset. Yes, this meeting with Francois and a number of colleagues in Ottawa 5 years ago was crucial for the conceptualization of this book. And as I acknowledged in the foreword of the book, probably was one of the best academic sessions I've ever attended. So thank you so much. And then I thought, okay, what can I contribute to the study of Canadian federalism? And I thought, one thing I can contribute, that I bring in some sort of a comparative perspective. But the comparative perspectives here and there that I use in the book are, of course, more meant to tell Canadian readers how they should situate what they know or do not know about Canadian federalism, than that it would be suitable for somebody in Argentina or Mexico. But I think you could probably, John very kindly mentioned that the book does have some sort of a theoretical foundation. So I'm talking about principles, I'm talking about constitutional concepts. I talk about concepts a lot. So you can probably read that and decide for yourself to the extent to which you recognize some of the same concepts, theories, problems in another country, and to what extent Canada is indeed some sort of case on its own. That's really all I can say.
Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions in our chat, and it's hard to choose from them.
We also have only 6 minutes.
Yeah, so we are a little tighter on time than I thought we would be. So I'm gonna drop from my prepared questions. We only had a few left anyways, and I'll go to the question and answer section, which for the audience is at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A section. You'll start seeing questions appear there. So the first question was from Fraser Hay, and his question was about present day challenges, in particular COVID-19 and the recent protest in Ottawa and at the borders that threaten fundamentals of Canada's federalism. in new ways. We're seeing a lot of requests, the public demanding action from different levels of government that may or may not have the legal right to do so. Will they threaten federalism in new ways, or will these new challenges be managed as they have before? Does anyone want to go first on this one? We'll go with Thomas.
I can go with a brief comparative observation. My colleague and co-author Alan Fenner in Australia, who has been very, shall we say, dismissive of Australian federalism. I think Australia is such a homogeneous society that federalism is actually more or less not needed, he says sometimes. But he found out that during COVID, federalism all of a sudden began to work, and it began to work quite well. And there is now, because of COVID, there is a stronger sense of the federal structure and two-order government policy making in Australia. I think COVID hasn't changed all that much. I personally, maybe somebody will have a different opinion, but I think the response to COVID as a response to something that was completely unprecedented and unrehearsed, the response of the federal system was actually, I thought, was quite okay. Of course, some provinces have done very different things from others. There is talk about, how Atlantic Canada created this bubble and had a policy of exclusion, almost like in China, of locking the borders, whereas the other provinces were more wishy-washy about their approach, oscillating between one policy to another. But I think by and large, the system showed that it worked. But what it also showed, and what also the truck protest in Ottawa showed, is that far too many Canadians have no idea what federalism in Canada actually is all about and who has what powers. Yeah. So in that sense, please put the book at the airport if you think. No, I'm just kidding. But that is perhaps one of the lessons, that when this COVID crisis struck and when the truckers approached in Ottawa, hardly anybody knew who was responsible for doing what. And that perhaps was also overall, in a societal sense, an impediment to efficiently dealing with the crisis.
Anyone with final comments, please be pithy. We have like 2.5 minutes left. I'll go to Francois first. He has his hand up, and then
yeah, very briefly, I agree with Tom that during the COVID, Ottawa respected the provincial jurisdiction and vice versa. And the collaboration was probably going smoothly and smoother than what we thought, with one exception. And the exception was when the federal government used the Emergency Act. There was an obligation to consult the provinces and to report on the consultation. And on both issues, the provinces were informed about what Ottawa wanted to do. And the report is probably getting a D- if I had to mark it, because the only thing we saw was who called whom and when, but about the substance of the consultation, there was zip nothing.
okay, I'm going to, I think that we're going to be out of time. I saw John had his hand up, but I see that it's 12:59 right now. So thank you to everyone. I wish that we had more time. I am really enjoying this. There's still so many questions that people have been asking. I think that we can do this all over again in a month and it would never end. But I think that is also a good indicator of Canada's vibrancy, that we're willing to have these conversations. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And this talk will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays.
And
Thank
I
you.
also want to